I'm very pleased to have here Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, a man who combines two careers in one body that I couldn't think could, I don't think that could be more timely and for this moment. Because Nafeez Ahmed is not only a major award-winning journalist, investigative journalist, but he's also an interdisciplinary academic who specializes in international security and complex systems theory. He's a best-selling author. I can't even describe all the number of initiatives he's created, but they all go to the heart and soul of what this next 3 days is about. Citizen-led initiatives to bring us together around understanding our circumstance, dealing with our issues cooperatively, finding new methods beyond the old sclerotic, highly compromised systems of governance, science, business, and so on that don't seem today to be even close to being adequate to the demands of this emergency. A voice, especially for deep interdisciplinary research into the systems and structures that impact our lives, along with the potential to change them for the better. And he's been an innovator in powerful ways to communicate this learning from such research to mass audience to facilitate coordinated actions. So I won't go through the list of his many awards. So rather than that, I would just like to present to you our invited guest lecturer, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed. Welcome, Nafeez.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Bill, for such a kind and generous introduction. And may I just thank everybody at the Laszlo Institute, including Ervin Laszlo himself. I'm personally a big fan of his work. So it's a huge, huge honor for me to be able to address you here and to open this really important symposium that you guys have organized. It's a huge delight for me to be able to do that, and I hope that I can do it some justice. So presumably I can share my screen. So the talk that I've got here called Global Phase Shift, Systems Frameworks to Navigate the Transition to a Post-Carbon Civilization. And this talk is really about trying to understand the moment that we find ourselves in now. And I'll just begin by setting the intentionality following the words that we've just heard. My intention in being here is really to be able to connect with all of you in facilitating us in being able to really kind of see and sense make what's going on at the moment, to develop a set of tools to do that, and hopefully to use that to develop a groundwork for inspiration for where we see ourselves going in the next few decades. This talk really starts with you and where you are and where you find yourself. And what I'm going to do is begin by running through some really simple concepts in understanding systems. You find yourself as part of a system. You're not alone. And the general way of understanding system is really quite simple. That, you know, you have two interconnected things, maybe A and B, that they have to be connected. And there is a relationship not only between them, but in their environment. And that kind of essentially determines the nature of that system. I'm not going to get too deep into all of these things, but I just want to lay a bit of a groundwork. One of the really interesting concepts that has become quite useful these days is complex adaptive system, the recognition that there are these systems which actually adapt to their environment, they change. And it's one of the interesting things about organisms and people like you and me, and not just that, but also societies and economies, that they are complex adaptive systems. They're actually able to change how they operate. The rules in which they relate to each other can change in relationship to their environment. And as a result of that, we see these emergence of these new things. One of the interesting ideas that I use this very basic analogy to explain the idea of emergence. I always use the example of water because it's very simple to understand the idea that H2O, you get these different sets of molecules, put them together in a certain way, and then when you stand up and take a bigger look, it has the properties of liquid, which then of course enable and constrain the way in which the parts relate to each other. I mean, that's just a really interesting analogy to understand what we're talking about, how the overall structure of a system can emerge and then enable and constrain what happens at the individual level. So these are some really important ideas to understand. Now, this diagram, the reason I want to bring this up is just because I want you to take note of these four arrows: info in and info out. And this is really important because one of the things that everyone's going to be really familiar with is the issue of information. And one of the most important things we understand is how an organization, how any system, whether it's an organism or a society, the way in which it relates to its environment is obviously going to be determined by how it processes information about its environment. And whether it's successful in processing that information and using that information to adapt the way in which its different constituent parts operate so that they operate harmoniously in relation to what's going on in the environment, really determines whether an organism or a species or a society or a civilization is able to move through the kind of the turbulence of evolution and move through different stages. So this is very, very key. And we're going to come back to the role of information again and again, and certainly at the end. So we're going to we're moving the camera further and further out to have a bigger picture. We started with you, we gave some examples about systems and how they work. And you obviously are an individual and you're part of lots of different systems, the family system, maybe the workplace environment, your wider community. And you'll find that there's you as a system, as a biological organism, and maybe a psychological organism, maybe a spiritual organism. You have all of these complexity. And then there's these amalgamations of other entities very much like you that you live with and work with and play with and grow with. And out of all of that, we have a wider human system. So we can see there's a huge multi-layered complexity going on here. And all of that, of course, enables and constrains what's going on at different levels. Now, the other really important thing that I want us to remember when we're going through some of the issues we're going to talk about is that we can't, because of this huge complexity, we mustn't make the mistake of trying to reduce the human system to any one thing. Often you get people who will say it's all about the economy, or it's all about relations of production, or it's all about the politics, or it's all about the ideology, it's all about this. And actually what we've now learned through system science is it's all of these, but not in a kind of silly haphazard way, but in the sense that all of these are fundamentally interconnected and interrelated. And changes in any one of these areas, whether it's ideology and culture, or politics, or the economy, we'll find that changes in any of those sectors will have ramifying changes across all of these other sectors. And that's why we find that change often takes place when it does happen quite rapidly. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but one of the things we see here also, we're homing down into the production system, which is one of the sectors that we mentioned, is that even here in the production system, we find huge complexity. Materials, food, transport, energy, information, these are kind of foundational sectors of our production system. And changes in each of those will entail changes in others. But of course, information in a way sits at the center because much of what happens there has ramifying implications for what happens elsewhere. We're going to come back to some of those ideas in a minute, but now we're going to widen our lens a bit more. And we realize that the human system doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of an Earth system. And of course, we can even go wider than that, and we'll find that we need to by the time we get to the end. But we just stop here for a minute to think, the human system and the Earth system, we've realized that the human system is part of a huge complex Earth system, which consists of many different things. We're used to thinking about our economy and our society in isolation. Social media, what we watch on TV, all of these things, when we get absorbed into it, we can tend to forget that really all of these things, all of the things that are happening in this world are only enabled by our wider relationships to the Earth. And when we look a bit deeper, we realize that there's all this other complexity that's going on in the climate system, the way in which our civilization extracts energy and materials from that system. There's oceans and forests and soils, there's an atmosphere. And of course, we're very used to relating to the Earth system in a relationship of we kind of take the things that we need and we use those things to produce and to distribute goods and services in our society. But what we're starting to learn is that we can't keep doing that without really being conscious of the impact on the Earth system. We have to start to realize how reciprocally intertwined these systems are. One of the really important concepts that I'm going to use today is this idea of tipping points. And of course, I started this talk with the title of global phase shift. One of the things that happens within different systems is they can change when they reach a tipping point. And I'm sure everybody's heard of climate tipping points. You know, what happens when, you know, something hits the tipping point in the Arctic, or there's a tipping point in the Amazon. You know, we keep hearing about these tipping points. And I guess the key idea is that a system can, you know, you can, when you look at how a system works, you can think about a set of relationships, and you can kind of define those relationships with this idea that there are certain, you know, we often use rules, this idea of rules and norms that determine how the system is operating. But what tends to happen in any of these systems is that when there is a lot of change going on at different levels within that system, sometimes it means that the rules begin to change. And that's when we talk about this idea of a tipping point, when that whole system, the rules require kind of a recalibration. And what's really important to think about when we're talking about the idea of a phase transition is when we have multiple different tipping points occurring at different spaces within an overall system, which means that the whole system and all the different subsystems that it's made out of could begin changing because of all of those different tipping points that are being kind of breached and hit or crossed in different ways. And what's really interesting is that it's important not just to think about tipping points in terms of the climate system or the ecology, but also to think about tipping points in terms of society. Many of us have heard about behavioral tipping points and what does it take, you know, for a mass of people to then change behavior on a wide scale, but also to think about tipping points from a whole wider thing in terms of like culture and civilization. What I'm going to do now is run through really quickly some of the big kind of ecological tipping points that we're facing, which really speak to the reality that we are facing an unprecedented ecological crisis. I'm just going to give you a few examples that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's really useful to once again remind ourselves and situate ourselves and really kind of connect to some of these crises. So one of the well-known tipping points, I mentioned the Arctic, is this thing called the albedo effect. And it kind of gives us a sense of how these tipping points work. And this diagram really illustrates how simple it is that we can have global warming. We home in on what's going on in the Arctic. We have these higher temperatures locally as a result of global warming. And that results in the ice melting. When the sea ice melts, there's less sunlight that's reflected back. What that means is that then there's more heat which is absorbed. As a result, there's more open water, more sunlight absorbed, and then that results in further warming effect. As a result of the deeper warming effect, global warming overall is increased. And so you end up on this kind of reinforcing cycle. And I think what's really important about what we're learning when we're looking at complex systems is that the kind of linear thinking that A causes B, and that's kind of the end of it, is now broken down. We're now realizing that A can cause B, and then by itself, as a result of that forcing, B will then continue to act back on A, and it can create a cycle which continues even when you stop what's going on with A. And the danger with these tipping points is that if we keep pressing A too long, it may well get to a point where that A-B self-reinforcing amplifying feedback then continues even when we remove the original source of the forcing. In this case, of course, carbon dioxide emissions. And there are many different examples of these tipping points. This is a graph from the Potsdam Institute, which gives you an illustration of the huge number of tipping points. And this is not even all of them, but these are some of the key ones where there are these risks at our current levels of emissions in the atmosphere. Right now, there are these risks that these particular ecosystems could cross tipping points. I think the other key thing is that due to the complexity of these issues, we really don't know. It's very difficult for scientists to determine when and how we actually cross these tipping points. We're only beginning to understand the sheer interconnected complexity. And of course, it's not just the tipping points by themselves. It's what happens when, you know, maybe we hit a tipping point in the Amazon, and we're hearing already about how parts of the Amazon rainforest are now beginning to emit more carbon than they are able to absorb. It's beginning to cross that threshold. Are we out of control yet? We actually don't know. It might be the case that it's already past a tipping point. And sadly, we may only know after the fact when we've crossed too many tipping points. So we can't really afford to be waiting around. The idea of planetary boundaries is kind of a wider way of looking at this issue. It's a different concept to tipping points, but it again talks about the idea that there are these key thresholds. And this is 4 thresholds that in 2009, Will Steffen, the well-known scientist, and his team concluded that these 4 particular thresholds around phosphorus, nitrogen, land system use, and fresh water use appear to have been crossed already. Now, the problem with crossing these planetary boundaries, again, is the unknown. Once we've crossed those boundaries, we know that we're in deep uncertainty, but we're just not sure at what point that uncertainty begins to go out of control. But the key message that these scientists who innovated this new framework for understanding planetary boundaries is that they said that once you cross planetary boundaries, you're really shrinking the space for human habitation during the period known as the Holocene. That period of hundreds of thousands of years when we had stability in the Earth system that was so wonderful for life to flourish is now slowly shrinking as we cross these planetary boundaries. And the idea is that if we cross all 9 of these boundaries, and we can see all of them listed here, then the risk is that too far into those crossings, into breaching those boundaries, then we get to a point where we may trigger what they call the hot house Earth scenario, which is a runaway warming effect where all different tipping points and different boundaries are crossed in such a way that we begin to lose control. And no matter what we do at that point, there is a risk that these unfolding tipping points then will then continue, and we could end up in an unmitigated disaster in an uninhabitable planet. And in that scenario, it's a worst case scenario. We don't quite know when and how that might happen. The best science tells us that 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees is kind of where that danger zone is. And once we begin to cross into that area, those uncertainties become bigger and bigger, and and the risks higher and higher. And we're in that danger zone right now. I'm going to run through a couple of other graphs, which are going to give you a sense of the state of acceleration that we're experiencing right now. Again, all of this stuff will be quite familiar to you, but I think it's the way we think about these things that's really important. So first of all, of course, we know that we've been exponentially increasing global carbon emissions over the last few hundred years that our industrial civilization has existed. We've seen that this dramatic increase in carbon emissions has been correlated with an increase in the way in which we are consuming. And I've used this graph of income levels to demonstrate that there is this connection with the way in which our economy is operating. We can also see this connection with energy consumption. So of course, something to do with our civilization. Our civilization is heavily dependent on fossil fuel resources, and there's been an exponential increase in our consumption of these resources, which is obviously fed into this escalation of carbon dioxide emissions. What's happened at the same time is we've seen this exponential increase in GDP growth. And that has, again, it's kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we don't really know where it's going to go, except to know that the idea of infinite growth on a finite planet clearly doesn't make any sense. But one of the interesting things that happened in recent years, and I draw your attention to the date here because it's going to keep coming up. In 1970, we recognized that we began to overshoot. So we've been going down this trajectory of exponential growth in so many different ways, but we've realized that the rate at which we're growing is outpacing the rate at which natural systems renew themselves. And so the Global Footprint Network have come up with this really powerful metric showing that the equivalent consumption is something like 1.5 going on 2 planets. Colossal amount of consumption that we're doing, and it's not sustainable. At the same time, the other interesting thing that we've seen is, again, you look around the date 1970, we've seen that there's been a kind of an exponential increase in the global debt to GDP ratio. And what's really ironic is that after 2008, the global financial crash, that debt ratio has actually increased. So instead of solving the debt problem, we've escalated it. While all of that has happened, the other interesting thing that's happened is there's been a strange inflection, and it's not because we've wanted to do it, but we've actually seen that in recent years, since around 1970, around the same time when we've had this inflection point with overshoot, there's been a decline in the rate of GDP growth. And this has been particularly marked in some of the most powerful industrial economies, Japan, Europe, and the United States. Again, it's kind of really taken off in the 1970s, and it's kind of escalated since then, this decline. And of course, kind of global growth kind of plateaued since around 2008, and we've again experienced a kind of rupture in growth since the pandemic that erupted last year. There's also an interesting correlation with energy, oil, and GDP, which I mentioned before, which is we've seen it again throughout this period. And that's just another graph to illustrate where we are right now in the wake of the pandemic. There's something really interesting is happening here. And there's this really important concept, and I'm going to bring all of this together in a moment, this idea of net energy decline, the concept of EROI, energy return on investment. And one of the interesting things that's happened is that we've seen that the global EROI has begun to decline around that same time, 1970. Now, what does this mean? Energy return on investment is this pretty simple ratio, but it can be complicated to really make it right, that tries to measure the amount of energy that we use compared to how much we get out. So we're using a certain amount of energy to extract fossil fuels from the ground and to convert that into useful energy that we can use in our societies. And what we've found is that we're using more and more and more energy to get that energy out. And as a result, the efficiency has declined. So that's also been an underlying issue that's been going on since around 1960, 1970. We've seen the total fossil fuel system going on this decline trajectory. At the same time, we've seen this huge increase in global inequality. And one of the things that I think is happening is that as we've moved into this trajectory of escalating consumption, escalating exploitation of energy resources, driven by this ideology of material consumption, we've moved into this space where the Earth system can't sustain it anymore. And as a result, we're kind of cannibalizing ourselves. So we've been cannibalizing our energy system in order to keep going. And as a result, we've also been increasing these environmental costs by pumping the CO2 into the atmosphere, all of which is increasing the overall costs on the economic system. And so the overall effect on that is that there's been a decline in GDP and an escalation in the kind of crisis potential. At the same time, in order to deal with this, our kind of financiers and our big investors and our kind of elite policymakers, their response is more business as usual. So what they've done is they did this ingenious thing in 1970, where they said, we're going to create credit as an instrument of profiteering. So rather than just continuing kind of the same way of doing capitalism as was done before, what they said is, one, we're going to outsource to poorer countries for cheaper labor and cheaper raw materials. And two, we're going to try and lend to people. And what a wonderful way of making money. If I just lend to people and they have to pay me back on interest, I don't have to do anything. I just literally create money in a computer and they have to pay me back on interest. And as a result of this reliance on financialization, we've had this huge escalation in debt. And we've kind of offset the debt to the future, to future generations. And so what we're really doing, what that debt really represents and what no one talks about is that's ecological debt. We see it in monetary terms, but really it's a debt that later generations have to pay. But increasingly, we're having to pay now when we see it in kind of the wildfires and the floods and the extreme things that are going on. But that debt is going to come back. And one of the manifestations of all of this, of course, is the increase in global income inequality, which has been absolutely horrendous. The other interesting pattern that we've seen is that there's an increase in the intensity of economic recessions. This is from a study in Nature Scientific Reports. Tim Jackson is a very well-known ecological economist, and they kind of track this. As you can see, this is quite a marked increase over the last few decades. In particular, again, from after the Second World War, but I would say from the 1960s onwards, and especially from 2000 and onwards. What do I think is really going on? I use this idea of phase shift. I believe that what's happening right now is we're experiencing fundamentally a transformation of our global system. And really what I've done here is spoke only about the negative side of that. And the negative side tells us that when we're looking at our society and the escalating levels of polarization, when we're looking at our economic system and the increasing wealth gap, when we're looking at our culture and the culture wars and our inability to have constructive conversations, when we're looking at our economies and we're looking at and fundamentally our ecological relationship, our relationship with nature, we're seeing this widening gap and it's escalating at an accelerating pace. But all of these tipping points are slowly being breached or on the verge of breaching them. And what that really suggests is that the whole system is going through this fundamental change where the rules and the relationships and everything is up for grabs. And that could be a really exciting thing. But right now, on our business as usual trajectory, it's a very dangerous thing. One powerful framework to understand the moment that we find ourselves in was produced by Thomas Homer Dixon, a political scientist in Canada, came up with this idea of synchronous failure. And I think the big risk that we face from a civilizational point of view is what happens when all of these things kind of kick off at the same time. And what we see, what Thomas Homer Dixon tried to get across with this powerful diagram, is that really, you might have a blip going on in the food system and a blip going on in the climate system. But when they happen at the same time, it could overwhelm the whole system, because while you're trying to firefight with the food system, you then have to firefight with the climate system at the same time. And suddenly your capacity to deal with these multiple fires your system is overwhelmed. And that leads to a multi-systemic crisis, which overwhelms the system even more. And of course, we all remember that this happened in 2008 with the multiple crises. We had the oil crisis, we had the climate crisis, we had multiple food basket failures, and so on and so forth. All of these things kind of kicking off at the same time. The other danger that we have, and this is a little diagram which I want to illustrate the relationship between the Earth system and the human system from a negative point of view, is what happens when we get locked in an amplifying feedback process from a global scale. And this is the big danger that we have, that an Earth system disruption, such as the ones that I've described, it can trigger a shock. And you can think of any of the things that have happened over the last few weeks, and that shock could trigger a systemic breakdown. The danger is that a systemic breakdown, instead of triggering a proactive response, a collective intelligence response, it triggers something else, something that we saw, for example, with the emergence of the Nazis, something that we saw in Rwanda, something that we saw, with the election of demagogues and the rise of populist politics, the otherization, where we blame particular groups and we focus on what's in front of us, the material, the skin color, the fact that someone says Allahu Akbar or whatever it might be. You focus on something that's in front of you and you say that's the problem. And the danger is that when you do that, you focus on that narrow issue, and instead of dealing with the real issue, you have a conflict. Meanwhile, while you're embroiled in that conflict, the real issues are still there. They're ongoing. The Earth system is there. The human system is there. You're really ignoring what's going on in those systems, and that crisis is rumbling away. And so there you have another shock and another trigger. And in fact, what you found is that you're so embroiled in your culture wars and your conflicts and all of that, that you're incapable of responding and understanding to what's going on. And so there's another Earth system disruption. And then the danger is that we get locked into a self-reinforcing amplifying feedback on the global scale, and that is essentially what collapse looks like. The collapse of civilization is not necessarily something which happens overnight, but something which takes place over a long, protracted period of time. And the people inside it maybe don't even know what's going on. But there is a lighter side to this, and this is where I really want to get your attention, is this idea of the adaptive cycle. Now, C.S. Holling was a very well-known ecologist who came up with this concept from the study of natural systems. And what he noticed is that natural systems go through this life cycle in all of their phases of life. And we can see this in biological organisms, we can see it in forest ecosystems, you can see it everywhere. And it's wonderful. And it shows that in every life cycle of a natural system, it goes through this phase of growth and then kind of conservation. And then there is a kind of a breakdown, and then there is a release of energy, and there's a reorganization phase, and then the life cycle begins again. And this is kind of the natural cycle of life. And when we map that adaptive cycle in kind of like a kind of temporal chronological sequence, it's even more insightful. We can see how these things kind of make sense. And you just imagine that this is a society or a civilization, and then you can begin to see how it might make sense for a human civilization. That's the idea of growth, conservation, release, and reorganization. So if we accept my contention that we are indeed in the middle right now of this momentous global phase shift, then what that suggests is that we have gone through this first phase of growth, and that we've now we've moved into the conservation phase. And maybe around 1970s to 2000, that conservation phase began to weaken. And as we've moved now from the 20s from the 2000s into 2020s, I think we're maybe at the beginning phase of that release stage, and we're kind of sliding down and moving down. And then there's going to be what we're heading towards and we're going to see more this reorganization phase. And what's really interesting and exciting, and it was the systems theorist Jeremy Lent that first really opened my eyes to what this really means, is that what it means is that we're seeing the old system breaking down. And we mustn't confuse the old system with ourselves, which is something that spiritual traditions have been trying to teach us for many, many years, for centuries and millennia. And we mustn't become attached to those things that we see around us, the politics, the economics, the ideas, the society, the way we do things. It's those old industrial, linear ways of seeing the world that are breaking down and the systems associated with them. And as it breaks down, it's losing control. And as it's losing control, there is this huge opportunity space, this massive, unprecedented possibility space that is going to open up and is opening up right now. And that space is where we plant the seeds for the next life cycle, for the reorganization of the human system. And this possibility is now happening for the first time in human history on a global scale. We know that human civilizations have risen and fallen in history over millennia, and they've gone through this same life cycle. But never before have we been able to look back with all the tools of knowledge and history and science at our disposal to understand how we got to where we are, and to make sense of it, and to make decisions about it, and to have conversations, and to say, where are we going to go next? And to really see it and sense make and envision what's going to come on a global scale. We've seen it happening in different nations, in different communities, in different tribes, but now for the first time, we're experiencing this phase shift on a global scale, and it's momentous. There are many, many different dimensions to this phase shift, and I'm going to basically focus on only, first of all, one side. I'm going to dwell very briefly on the technological side, and then we're going to talk about the implications of that. There are some positive things happening on the technological side. But in order to understand what those technological things are, we have to realize that technology cannot save us. Instead, what we've realized is that we've found ourselves at this moment where we ourselves as individuals have to play a key role as disruptors of the old paradigm and as agents of regeneration. How do we usher in an adaptive response? How do we usher in and really make the most of this opportunity for breakthrough change? What our civilization has done is provide us with some powerful tools that we can use, which is very, very interesting. So nobody can say that we can't take a leap forward, that we don't have the capacity, that everything's just going to collapse and it's just the end. There's a couple of interesting things that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is that we now know that technology disruptions and societal disruptions can happen very, very fast. And I'm just going to give two very simple examples of this. One is the replacement of horses by cars, which happened in the 1900s. And there was a time, for example, over millennia, when no one would think that we could travel without horses. Horses were the dominant mode of transport for the vast majority of human civilization. But suddenly there was this convergence of certain technologies that came together, and the right things happened at the right time in the right way. And as a consequence, finally, the automobile combined with the automobile assembly line and various other things. And it all came together so quickly. And then within 13 years, no one was going around in horses and cars took over. Now, what's really important to realize with this example, I've also given the example of digital cameras, but let's focus on the horse example. There were benefits to that, of course. Going around in your car, it transformed our societies in so many ways. It transformed logistics, transport, how we eat, how we deliver, how we work, how we commute. It transformed the design of our cities, but it also brought with it horrendous systemic ramifications that no one thought about. We ended up becoming so dependent on fossil fuels. We ended up pumping so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It transformed our ability to make war on each other. We created new tools of war and killed so many more people. So the important thing to realize is technology is neutral. We have found that we've got greater capacity to do things, but we need to think really clearly, and it's really up to us about how we do that. And on that note, I'd like us to think about what's happening over 3 key areas of the production system right now. Wright's law tells us that some of the changes in disruptive technologies can happen very, very quickly, like with cars. Some changes take a long time, but specific types of technology can take place and take over, and due to economics, in a matter of 10, 15 to 20 years. You can think about things like smartphones or microwave ovens to see the kind of changes that they can implement. Now, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because of the tremendous implications that it implies for our opportunity to act. First of all, let's just go through these 3 or 4 sectors that I think are really important to understand. One is the information disruption that's taken place. We've moved from this kind of position of kind of centralized hierarchical control over information, which still exists, to this kind of interesting disruption of information where more and more people are now able to become owners and distributors of their own content. And that's been enabled by some of these things like the smartphone, the internet, and things like that. But we're moving into this interesting space where there's been this information disruption, which has changed the information landscape. It's had its positive, but what we've also seen is it has huge negatives, because there's a question of our maturity as human beings and our ability to dialogue and our ability to use this information disruption to make sense together of what's really going on. And what's happening right now is that we've learned that as a species, how deeply immature we are, and we're incapable really of taking advantage of this really interesting and powerful moment. And instead we're fighting with each other, becoming more polarized. But there are some other interesting things that's also happening. In the energy system, there's a huge disruption that's taking place. One of the exciting things happening with solar, winds, and batteries suggests that in a matter of decades, these renewable energies will become cost competitive, in fact, and many orders of magnitude cheaper than conventional fossil fuels, which is an exciting prospect. Another thing that's happening is in transport, that there is suddenly this opportunity to switch to electric vehicles, and which again could maybe transform things in many different ways. There's another interesting disruption in food that's taking place in regard to precision fermentation, which is this ability to program protein molecules and to make any kind of to brew any kind of protein that you want without needing to use animals. And again, the cost curves on this are again really, really exciting. The costs have already come down over the last few decades and are being used in certain materials and cosmetics, and they've come down exponentially. And if that continues on that rate, again, we're looking at huge dramatic cost reductions, which could make this kind of technology available everywhere. Now, one of the interesting things about I would like us to envision for a moment what could happen in the future. There are various scenarios. One scenario is that we have the Facebooks and the Googles of the world that continue to try to monopolize these technologies. And we get lost in culture wars and information wars and people trying to dominate the new energy system, that we have, kind of wasteful industrial practices to do with mining for renewable energies and so on and so forth. Another way, however, is to rethink what the potential is. For example, if we're switching to electric cars and cars become really, really cheap, one of the potentials is that people don't need to own cars anymore. They just they're so cheap to use that means there's less cars on the road because cars are being used more often because of the longer life cycle of batteries. That could mean less need for steel. that could mean that we don't need huge oil and gas infrastructure. We can recycle it and repurpose it for all other types of things. It also means that we could focus on rewilding when we have less land used for livestock farming. We could do new types of carbon sequestration. We could think about agroecology. There's lots of blue skies thinking we can think about when we start imagining the possibility of a new system. But there's one fundamental sticking point here, and that's that our organizing system needs to adapt. Technology is just tools. And what's really interesting is that at this moment of great phase shift, our industrial civilization has produced simultaneously across these multiple sectors of the production system. We found that there are these disruptive technologies which hold some potential to change the way we do things. They're not going to change everything. And that's, I find, very interesting. And we find we're really in the middle of these multiple tipping points. There are these devastating ecological tipping points. And there are these really interesting social, behavioral, and technological tipping points. And it's all happening at the same time. And all of this adds up to the idea that there is this huge phase shift. But what do we need to do to really recognize what's going on and to kind of move into a new system without making the mistakes that we've made before? We have to change the way we see things. We have to change the way we do things, because it's quite possible that we could move into, we could take certain types of technology and we could take certain types of thing, and we could end up creating another dystopian system that only benefits a few. And if we don't do it in the right way, if we don't act in the right way with the right speed, we could end up finding that everything around us collapses before we're even ready to transition to something else. So in order for us to really move forward, the biggest, most fundamental shift that's taking place is really about our value system. And for me, one of the most important things is in the sphere of ideology, and how ideology has fed into many of the other ways of doing things. And what we've now realized is that the ideology that we've had that's kind of animated this old system has been reductionist. It's reduced human beings to atomistic, disconnected individuals who must compete for material consumption at ever accelerating rates. But what we're seeing, what all of these signals are telling us, these signals of tipping points, all of that information that's coming at us from our relationship to the natural world and to each other, these are all signals telling us repeatedly that your old paradigm, that this old way of doing things, this system that you've created, this way of being in the world, this way of seeing the world is wrong. It's dysfunctional. It is leading to your potential extinction as a species on planet Earth. So what more greater evidence could we have from an empirical point of view that a worldview which is based on love, that is based on compassion, that is based on generosity, that is based on cooperation and coming together and collective intelligence, that such a way of being in the world is actually objectively going to harmonize us with the world around us? And what does that say about that value system? That is a value system that has objective, evolutionary, functional value. It's real. There is something real about these values, about love, about compassion, about justice, about generosity. These represent behavioral patterns that can genuinely connect us with each other and with the natural world. And it's by adapting our system to those values that we will find a way through this phase shift and be able to create a wonderful new life cycle. And I've listed here all the areas that we need to be thinking about in this new paradigm of politics. It includes energy, but not just, let's just have renewable energy and let's just have solar panels on the roof. No, we need to think about what this means for a decentralized, local, participatory energy system. How are we going to share and exchange energy together? And obviously the same with electricity, smart microgrids transforming our urban infrastructure. How does that change how we think about supply chains? That we need to start, if we're going to embrace this value system, then we need to move away from wasteful practices towards circular economy principles, where we recycle, where we think consciously about reusing as much as we can, rather than simply kind of fast fashion, wasting, throwing things away. And also thinking about how to move for local, small manufacturing to empower people in their communities. And it's the same thing with jobs. We can rethink jobs. Instead of thinking about a relationship where we as individuals are kind of wage slaves working for giant companies, what happens when these new tools and ideas allow each of us to become producers of food, water, technology, and energy as part of the system? How does that look? How do we make that work? What does that mean for jobs? We have to think about money. We have to rethink how we do money, because we've seen that the debt system doesn't make any sense. We have to rethink how we exchange. We have to think again about how we organize our companies, moving away from a focus on just purely on profits towards a more inclusive and cooperative economic enterprise. I don't know whether that means we completely jettison profits or not, but there are many other things. And I realize that I think William has indicating to me that we are out of time. And on that note, I will simply say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And I hope that this gives you some good food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nafeez. Food for thought, I'd say a feast for thought, and a very excellent briefing, really, for A Planet in Peril, and also a preparation for where the trajectory of this symposium will go, because we're going to stay on this theme of where we're at right now in this session, but know that this is a preparation that actually moves on to very much in the direction that Nafeez was indicating of where we are going to. And in the next session, we're going to consider the principles of it. And in the session that follows and that concludes today's program, we're actually going to meet with some of the real activists, intellectuals, and workers who will describe to you some of their own initiatives and engagement in this world at various levels, from the local to the international, and give us a feeling for what it is when we all come together and congregate can actually be done.